So fourth talk for the day. So our fourth keynote speaker is Professor Stephen Young. Steve is joining in now. So Professor Steve is in the Accounting and Finance Department at Lancaster University, has a track record of working with financial narratives, financial reporting quality, and has a strong links with the UK's FRC, FCA, PLSA, and the IRS. I started working with Professor Stephen Young when I joined Lancaster, so he was one of those leading the work on financial narratives at Lancaster University. Has a long experience with UK narratives and how to extract things using NLP and information extraction. So today's talk by Steve is he's talking on different languages, identifying and realizing the synergies between NLP and financial market research. So Steve, do you want to load your slides and join in the presentation?
Thanks, Mohammed, and hi to everyone. Thanks for the kind introduction. So yeah, I'm going to share my screen with you. So hopefully you'll be able to see this. So I've amended my title slightly, but the content is the same, and I thought I'd amend my title just to provide a bit of an analogy and a bit of a metaphor for what I'm about to talk about. A bit more about my background and how that's informed what I'm going to talk about today. So my background is accounting and finance, so I have kind of zero experience in NLP until I started working with Paul and Mahmood at Lancaster, and we've been working together for kind of 6 or 7 years now on a range of projects which use financial text to sort of study issues around disclosure quality and in particular the characteristics of annual reports and earnings announcements. And so what I thought I'd talk about today, rather than give you a specific paper, I thought I'd just give you some reflections on how I see the combination of NLP and finance, and where some of the potential issues are in making progress in those two disciplines, and how we might think about providing structures that mean we can work together more productively in the future. And I know I'm preaching to the converted here because we've got a serious sample selection problem that all of you who are at this conference are essentially already wedded to this interdisciplinary approach. But that doesn't really, I don't think, reflect the mainstream of both our disciplines. So I think a lot of what I say today will be clear to you because you're already in this space, but it may provide some context as to why it's not always easy to get traction in this kind of interface between NLP and finance, and how we might be able to improve the level of engagement between those two disciplines in the future. And so my title is borrowed unashamedly from a poem by Rudyard Kipling, and it's kind of I thought it was quite nice because it illustrates probably the issues that I'm going to talk about. So The Ballad of East and West is a poem by Rudyard Kipling that talks about two soldiers in India, one who's a kind of local Indian chieftain and a British soldier, and they come from very different cultural backgrounds, and they start off being enemies, and then they go through a process where they sort of learn to accept each other and live together, and in effect, in the end, they learn to collaborate for the greater good. And I think that's quite a nice metaphor, maybe, for how we might want to see the relationship between NLP and accounting and finance emerging. I don't think yet we're at the live happily ever after stage, but I think we're certainly starting to to appreciate what each other's disciplines can bring to the party. And so that's an important step forward. So I'm happy to take questions as I go, by the way. So don't think you've got to wait until the end. If you've got a question, you feel free to interrupt on the mic, or if you post something in the chat, maybe Mahmood, you could pick it up and ask. Yeah, so don't feel you've got to wait till the end if you've got something pressing or interesting to say, an interesting observation. It'll be probably more interesting than what I'm going to say. So how would I characterize the relationship between NLP and accounting and finance at the moment? And remember, I'm talking about the mainstream, and I would probably characterize it as two disciplines interested in broadly the same issues around text processing in finance, kind of heading in the same direction, but not necessarily merging and interacting in the way you might hope in order to get the best results. So very much kind of progressing in parallel, but not necessarily exploiting the synergies that might exist. And to give you some examples of that, I've just done two very basic caricatures of NLP and finance. So, and I must apologize for this because, of course, they're caricatures. They are gross oversimplifications, but they serve to illustrate hopefully the main points. So the NLP caricature I'll give you looks like this. So my experience working with Mahmood and Paul is that NLP places obviously a lot of emphasis and effort on developing models and techniques to analyze text in all sorts of scenarios. So I class that as the kind of input. And so there's a massive industry around sophisticated ways of thinking about modeling text. And then, of course, there's a whole industry in looking at how we interpret the output of those processes. So that might be classification processes, it might be summarization, it might be, a whole bunch of things. But there's a whole industry in NLP that it does a really good job of understanding how these models work, and where they perform poorly and where they perform well. I think from my side, the kind of weakness in the NLP literature is the financial market data set, which is what these sophisticated models are being applied to. And so why I see that as a weakness is because financial data is, it's pretty technical. There's a lot of domain specificity there. And so it's not like a sort of mover review in the sense that it's, pretty straightforward to interpret, and you get a nice, easy label on the data because you get it reviewed. And so even if you don't necessarily understand the movie and you don't understand all the criticism, you've got a neat label there that you can use for things like classification. The problem with financial market data is that, because it contains a lot of jargon, because there's a lot of domain specificity, it's really quite hard to get a handle on that data if you're not trained in that area. And so I would say that if you can't get a good handle on the data that you're using, that you're applying your models to, then it obviously creates limits in terms of what you can do and how you interpret the results. And so I'd see two dimensions, give you two examples of dimensions where I think, it's potentially problematic for people in NLP to make substantial progress on their own in the financial markets arena. So the first one is this issue around domain expertise. And that's, of course, the language of accounting and finance, which is very technical, it's very jargon heavy, and it's very specific to the discipline. And if you don't understand it, it becomes very hard to understand the text. So I'll give you two simple examples. A word like equity and bigram like fair value in accounting have very specific meanings. So one is an element of the financial statements, that's equity, and fair value is a measurement process about how we recognize elements in the financial statements. Now, if you didn't know anything about financial reporting, you might look at equity and fair value and think, that that we're talking about some sort of social justice or some sort of economic fairness, because without the context, you don't know what that language means, and so without that knowledge of the domain, it actually becomes quite difficult to train models in a supervised way. Obviously, you can use kind of unsupervised techniques, but you lose a lot of the opportunity if you don't understand that data set. But in order to understand the data set, you've got to have an enormous kind of almost professional knowledge to do that. And the best example that I can point you to, if you're in the NLP literature, there's a very famous paper that was published in the Journal of Finance by authors Loughran and MacDonald. And what that paper did is it was a really simple idea. They just pointed out that they were trying to measure tone in US firms' annual filings, so a bit like the annual report. And they pointed out that, normal dictionaries that we would get from places like General Inquirer or Luke don't represent this domain expertise. So a word like liability, which if you look in most kind of standard dictionaries drawn from typical English, would be a negative word. If you apply that word in a financial context, you're going to get awful results, because liability is an element of the financial statements. It's a neutral term in finance. It doesn't have a sign associated with it. And so the point being that if you don't understand the language and you don't tailor the language to meet the domain, then you're going to run into some pretty serious problems. And that becomes really hard for NLP specialists because the domain is very technical. Similarly, one of the attractive things about financial market data is that there's loads of pre-labeled information around if you know where to look. So one of the really nice features I think that financial data has is there's already lots of independent categorizations out there that we can use to build and train models and evaluate them. So we're thinking of splits between things like firms that commit fraud and firms that don't commit fraud. Firms that win annual reporting awards and firms that don't. Or within the annual reports, which has been some of the focus of today's discussion, we have labeled sections of the annual report. So we have the commentary from management, which in the US is called the MD&A. We have financial statements. We have sections dealing with corporate governance and remuneration. So that kind of independent labeling is extremely attractive. The problem from an NLP perspective is if you don't really have a good understanding of the discipline and you don't have a good understanding of the way accounting and finance data is put together, you're not going to really understand these labels. And if you don't understand the labels, you're not going to be able to use them in the most optimal way to build models. The simplest example I can probably give you to illustrate this would be, I've seen a number of papers in the NLP literature which use stock price as a label. So the idea being stock prices reflect information within markets in a pretty instantaneous manner. And so you can look at the change in stock price as an indication of information around at that particular time, whether it's a day or whether it's a particular time point. And so we can use the direction of the stock price change, whether that's positive or negative, as a sort of independent label that we can use to train models to measure things like sentiment. I mean, that's absolutely fine. And it sounds pretty non-controversial and pretty straightforward until you start to understand that there's a whole industry in finance that spends its time modeling asset prices. And the focus of that literature is that asset prices are affected by a whole bunch of things, not just text from financial reports. And so in order to understand the impact of a particular type of information, the one you might be interested in, so it might be the 10K or it might be an earnings announcement, you can't really just look at raw stock price. You've really got to look at what the expected stock price would have been, given everything else, but ignoring this piece of information you're interested in. And that requires a particular type of asset pricing model to do that, to identify expected returns and unexpected returns. But for colleagues in natural language processing, that asset pricing literature is, it's a bit of a challenge to say the least. And so what you see is people using raw stock price, but that really is a gross oversimplification, and you're going to get a lot of measurement error and a lot of noise in your labels. So from my perspective, the NLP literature brings a whole toolkit, whole load of opportunity, but it doesn't necessarily have the skill set to understand the data that those tools are being applied to. And probably a good example of that is if we look at something like the Stanford sentiment analysis tool, which is this fancy sentiment analysis tool that's been developed using recursive neural networks, sophisticated tree banks. It does a really good job of measuring sentiment in mover reviews, which is what it's trained on. But if you apply that apparatus, even though it's incredibly sophisticated, if you apply that to financial data, you get junk results. Why? Because financial discourse is incredibly different from the discourse of mover reviews. And so you can't take something trained in one setting and apply it to another, particularly because the domain of finance is so idiosyncratic. So just because we have the tools and there's data out there doesn't mean we're guaranteed great results. My caricature of the finance literature is, which I know a little bit more about, is probably even more negative. So mainstream finance and accounting literature focusing on text, I would classify 99% of it as really being basic bag of words analysis and no more. So if you look at the sort of things that dominate in mainstream accounting and finance literatures, and I keep emphasizing this mainstream because I know I'm amongst colleagues here who are operating more at the interface and probably way beyond what the mainstream is, but in a way that's not the point. The mainstream is still to catch up. And so what you're seeing in the mainstream literature is, there's still a focus on basic either surface level characteristics or very, very naive measures. So the standard thing that people will do, even in top journals in accounting, is they'll look at things like the FOG index for readability, which, is not a domain specific measure to start with, but they seem to manage to ignore that and apply it anyway. And we've got plenty of evidence that it doesn't work, but people keep applying it. And when it comes to measuring things like tone, we're not using sophisticated classifiers. The majority of the literature, even in the very top journals, is using some very naive, simple word lists. So, we're operating at what we think is the cutting edge of the discipline if you look in the top journals, but actually they're using NLP techniques that are probably, 40, 50, 60 years old at least. So miles behind the cutting edge in terms of technique. The cutting edge in accounting and finance probably goes as far as using some simple classifiers like naive Bayes. But even there, the application of those techniques is really poor. So, you get papers in top journals that say they applied a naive Bayes classifier. You'll get very little information about things like hyperparameter tuning. You'll get no discussion of things like sample balancing. Essentially, the black box that we talked about in NLP around data, the black box in accounting and finance is the method. So a lot of people who are using these methods, even quite basic classifier methods, they don't really fully understand the technique. They're applying sort of off-the-shelf algorithms. And as a consequence, there's a danger you end up with sort of quasi-science. Is it's presented as something being very scientific and very rigorous, but actually the way it's been applied is really quite poor, and it's certainly not very transparent. Same with things like topic modeling. So we're seeing LDA emerging in the accounting and finance literature as being, quite sort of de rigueur. and seen as being really rather sophisticated in terms of modeling text. But, you know, as most of us know, LDA is a pretty limited approach to measuring topics. It has some very limiting features of it, and there's a whole bunch of methods for extracting topics from text that are much more sophisticated than LDA, which just never feature in the accounting and finance literature at all. They're just not discussed. And likewise, what you see increasingly in accounting and finance is LDA being used not as a summary of text, but as a way to then extrapolate and build measures on unseen data. And of course, that's two very different approaches to topic modeling. So most of us can probably live with topic modeling around summarizing text within sample. But the idea that we can then take those word lists associated with topics and we can apply them to unseen text, and we can start to use those measures as a way to measure topics out of sample, starts to become potentially problematic, particularly when we don't have a lot of information about the validation of these methods. And that's a particularly poor area in accounting and finance. We see very little attempt at word sense disambiguation in the accounting and finance literature. So things that would be seen as standard in NLP, so things like, you know, the first thing you would probably want to do is apply some sort of parts of speech tagger. You might apply some semantic tagging. You might want to do named entity recognition to get some disambiguation. They would be standard processes in an NLP processing pipeline. You don't see any of that in the accounting and finance literature, even in the very top journals. What they tend to do is they'll download the text, they'll do some very basic tokenization, and then off they go, and that's it. So all the things that you in NLP have learned to deal with over the last sort of 30, 40 years about trying to understand meaning and context, that's sort of completely bypassed in the accounting and finance literature. And we just go and apply a off-the-shelf word list without any of this disambiguation, and then we expect to get great results. And of course, you know as well as I do that the results are probably going to be far from ideal, and there's a danger that you're measuring something else from what you think you're measuring. So, you know, very, very problematic, I would say. You also see very limited aspect level analysis in the accounting and finance literature. So the standard approach that we would see would be download a document like the 10K, strip out the management discussion and analysis. At best, a lot of papers just take the whole 10K, but at best they would strip out the MD&A, and then they would just measure tone across the entire MD&A, not even at the sentence level, and then aggregate sentences up. It would just be a simple word count of the entire MD&A section. No attempt to differentiate between whether the discussion is focusing on strategy, on performance, on particular markets, on particular products, none of that. So, you know, almost no attempt at aspect level analysis at all. And of course, as a consequence of that, we lose massive amount of information, and we also risk corrupting the sorts of measures we're interested in, because we may come to conclusions that the narrative is positive when actually it's only positive about one aspect and all the rest is either neutral or negative. And so, you know, it's incredibly problematic, I think. And there's very limited attempts, as far as I'm aware, to move from that aggregate approach to text to a more aspect level analysis. And then finally, kind of touched on it already, the way validations are done in the accounting and finance literature is at best indirect. So the typical study will measure a construct, so something like tone, and then they'll attempt to validate that construct And rather than constructing a gold standard and then doing a proper classification to see whether the method is able to replicate that gold standard, the method that is used typically in the literature is you'll get your construct and then you'll correlate it with a bunch of variables that you might expect to correlate with your construct of interest. So say if I was measuring tone, how do I test if my measure of tone is valid? Well, I might correlate it with stock price. And I might argue that I would expect the tone of my 10K to be positively correlated with stock price because both are picking up the same information set. Okay, well, maybe that's the case, but it's a big leap of faith at one level. I think even if that is correct and we can infer something from the sign of the correlation, it tells us nothing about key characteristics such as bias and the extent of measurement error. So it tells us nothing about power. Just because we observe a correlation coefficient of 70% tells us nothing about the extent of measurement error. And it tells us nothing about the direction of measurement error. So are we biased? Is our measure biased towards particular settings, particular outcomes? We have no way of testing that through a correlation analysis. And so obviously in accounting and finance, people draw conclusions that their measure works from these correlations when actually we don't really know whether it works or not. All as we know is it correlates with some underlying constructs that that may be capturing the same information set or may not be capturing the same information set. So in terms of opportunities, I think this is an area where there are obvious synergies from accounting and finance working closely together. It seems like it's a win-win for both disciplines. If accounting and finance can exploit the techniques in NLP, and if NLP can exploit the domain expertise in accounting and finance, it's a no-brainer. And I suspect there's an awful lot of low-hanging fruit to be had here. The challenge is how we exploit these synergies. And I think it sounds simple and it sounds obvious that we should be doing it, but there's actually quite a few structural barriers in place that prevent this. And so understanding what those structural barriers are, I think, is quite important so that we can break some of those barriers down and move forward. So what do I see as some of the barriers? Well, first of all, skill set, obviously. We have two disciplines where the training rarely overlaps. So in NLP, most NLP researchers will have little or no training or expertise in financial markets. And to pick that information up independently is extremely challenging. Likewise, if you go to accounting and finance, PhD programs, or even undergraduate and master's programs, there's almost nothing about NLP. It's starting to emerge at PhD level, but only at a very basic level. So the skill sets on both sides are extremely limited. And actually, I don't think it makes much sense for NLP researchers to try and become experts in accounting and finance or vice versa. That's not our comparative advantage. It makes much more sense from an efficiency perspective if we can combine our skill sets in the interface. But how we bring the disciplines together to do that is quite a challenge. Language is part of the problem. So we talk different languages. Often we talk about the same things, but we use a different language to do it. So the obvious example would be around evaluation. You know, you have your language of precision and recall and F1 and macro F1 and all of these things, whereas in accounting and finance, you know, we're dealing with measurement error and bias, and we're focused on type 1 and type 2 errors. It's pretty much the same thing, but it's not presented in the same way. And so a casual observer might conclude that we're talking about very different things, but actually we're talking about exactly the same thing. If you look in classification, you know, you would see something simple like a logistic classifier being used. Well, logistic regression is standard in accounting and finance, but we don't use the term classification, and we don't think of it as a classifier. We're normally thinking of it around hypothesis testing. If we are thinking about out of sample, we're normally using words like prediction rather than classification. So that whole language and discourse is actually, we've got a lot of common ground, but we don't present it in a way that makes people understand it's common ground. So I think that's a challenge. It was a real eye-opener for me working with Paul and Mahmood, because it exposed the difference in discipline norms between what we do. So so I started to learn pretty quickly working with Paul and Mahmood that, you know, conferences and conference proceedings were absolutely critical to success in NLP, because that was the way you disseminated your findings. That was the way you started to generate interest in your work and generate citations. So writing conference papers and presenting at conferences was absolutely critical, and that was an output in itself. In accounting and finance, we don't have anything like that. So if I present a paper at a conference, it kind of counts for nothing for me. And I would definitely not want to publish any of my work at a conference, because then it means I can't publish it in a journal. And it's journal publications that count in accounting and finance. That's the sort of measure of dissemination in the discipline. And so you've got these two things kind of butting up against each other. And it's only when you start to work across disciplines that you start to realize there's this whole different apparatus for disseminating work, and it's very different. I think the other obvious thing that I learned pretty quickly was just the lead time associated with research in the two areas. So in NLP, you know, it's a dynamic discipline. Things are evolving very quickly. So it's about getting your work out to market quickly. It's about getting feedback so that other people can start to work on it and develop it. That's all part of the process. So you're probably going from inception of an idea to presenting your work at a top conference, maybe within the space of something like 6 months. Maybe 12 months would be really slow. In accounting and finance, if you're publishing in a top journal, one of the top journals, you're probably looking at an average time from inception of the research idea to publication of around about 5 or 6 years. Okay, so straight away you're just operating on different timescales, different incentives, and then I suppose the other obvious difference would be around how transparent we are about what we do. So in NLP, it's all about making your code and data available so that other people can validate and work on that. That transparency is absolutely critical. In accounting and finance, you know, we spend a lot of time building barriers to entry so that people can't get our data and can't get our code, so that we can exploit those comparative advantages to our benefit, but probably to the negative effect on the discipline. So it's really only recently that people have started to realize that publishing code and publishing data is actually really important. So again, this whole mindset difference, and of course that results in differences in incentives. So for me as an accounting and finance researcher, I have almost zero incentives to publish conference proceedings at a top NLP conference. It counts nothing towards my promotion, nothing towards how I'm evaluated. Whereas I know that Paul and Mahmood, you know, they're looking at that. We've got co-authored papers and they're kind of scratching their heads because we've been working on these papers for like 6 years now, and we still haven't got them published. And they're thinking, what's in this for me? You know, I'm going to be retired and taking my pension before the outcomes arise. So a whole different set of incentives around the discipline. So how we move behavior is kind of constrained by these structural barriers. So obviously the question is how can we foster better collaboration. And I know I'm talking to the converted here because you guys are already doing it. But what I would say is that you're the minority. The majority are still operating in these silos, and as a consequence, we're not realizing these synergies. And so we probably have to try and look for mechanisms to overcome these structural barriers. And so what might those mechanisms be? Well, I think the big research questions are one thing that will drive us to do more interdisciplinary research. So a lot of the big questions now that we have to answer as researchers cannot be answered by taking a single discipline approach. So the nature of the research question is forcing us to look outside our own discipline and work with colleagues in other disciplines. And I think that's really encouraging. And so I think the fact that we're having to address these multidisciplinary questions is going to force us to work together more. My concern is that we're not moving quickly enough in that direction, and that as a consequence, we're not making as much progress on these big questions as we should be. Another area where I see a lot of scope for collaboration between the two disciplines is actually in the applied market. So I do quite a lot of work with asset managers and regulators. And what I'm starting to realize is that those guys who are actually operating in the market on a practical level, they're miles ahead of the accounting and finance discipline, because they're already using NLP to solve accounting and finance problems. So if I look at, top investment banks, they're not hiring PhD graduates in finance anymore. They're hiring graduates in NLP or physics or data science, because they're the skills you need in order to solve financial reporting problems that involve unstructured data. So if we want to find a sandpit for effective collaboration, I think a really good place to look is in practice, because it's already happening there. And so coming together with practitioners I think is a really good way of bringing our disciplines together. And that, of course, from an academic perspective, relates to the impact agenda. So in the UK, we're currently going through, I think, quite a structural change in how we view research quality. So we're starting to move much more towards a measure of research quality that's about how much difference have we made in practical terms, rather than just how many papers have we published in top journals. And so that impact agenda is forcing us to work with practitioners and ask practical questions. And again, in order to have impact, we've probably got to start working together, working with practitioners, working on big questions. So that whole impact agenda, I think, is going to be very constructive for us working together. And then also, I think there's probably a lot of scope for developing teaching programs that combine our skills. So if I look at the type of skill set that a graduate in finance needs now, sure, they need to know about debits and credits, and they need to know about asset pricing, but increasingly they need to be able to code at a very basic level. They need to be able to understand a bit of AI at a basic level. They need to be able to understand how to interpret, visualize data. So I think there's a lot of opportunity for us when we're developing our undergraduate and postgraduate programs, that we can again start moving out of our silos, and we can start to work together on teaching programs that combine these skills. And the more we work together on our teaching portfolio, the more we'll start to realize that we've got loads in common in the research space. And I suspect that will prompt interesting conversations and lots of collaboration. So that's my kind of whistle-stop tour. Thank you for inviting me and for listening. I'm happy to take questions if there are any. And if you've got any kind of more pressing issues and we run out of time, then you're welcome to follow up with me. I can share my details in the chat if you want to email me.
Steve, don't know if I'm still unmuted. Try to unmute myself. Try again. Maybe none of them can. I think, yeah, I'm unmuted now. Thanks a lot, Steve. That's really interesting. I mean, working with you actually for the past 6 and 7 years, I've learned a lot, but I'm still way behind in knowing everything about like data, especially in accounting and finance. But it looks like, for me, it looks like the danger is like a double-edged sword. So you've got, as you said, like a bit of needs between what every like, let's call it a sector, like what every field wants. But my question is, could that danger kind of like reach the production phase? So we're talking about like NLP companies, maybe NLP practitioners who would think this is like a fresh field, a lot of work can be done on such data, and then produce a product that could come up with decisions that might be vital for, let's say, investment or something like that. What can be done to make sure that this is, I don't want to say regulated, but at least checked to make sure it is producing what it's claiming to?
So really good question, Mahmood. And my impression is that there is a lot of bad practice out there. There's a lot of companies selling some pretty poor NLP solutions. And you know, it's kind of natural. People look for low-hanging fruit. But that doesn't mean it's good. So there's definitely a lot of stuff out there that people are making huge claims that you can extract information using their model, and that you can use that as a basis for trading decisions. You know, I think people should be extremely skeptical of these models, and if you're going to use them, you should definitely be asking for more information about how they're done. And if they're not going to tell you, which a lot of them don't because they treat it as proprietary, then I think you should remain incredibly skeptical. But I suppose the nice thing about financial markets is that where you do get poor quality products and where people start using poor quality products, it creates an opportunity. So if a data vendor like Bloomberg or Thomson Reuters come up with a tool that they claim can extract information and predict future returns, and people start trading on that, and those models are proved subsequently to be wrong, then their investment decisions will be wrong. And what that does is it creates an opportunity for more sophisticated investors who've got more sophisticated models to make money and exploit that mispricing. So the nice thing about financial markets is you can have dumb people doing dumb things, and it provides as much an opportunity as it does a cost. The danger, I think, is that where you get claims being made and you're drawing in unsophisticated investors who don't know better, and there's a risk that the unsophisticated investors are exploited. You know, they come and they invest in good faith, only to find that they're using tools that don't really work, and they're really being exploited by smarter people in the marketplace. So in terms of regulation, I think it's hard to regulate this market. I think it's very much caveat emptor, you know, buyer beware with these techniques. You need to be really skeptical. And if someone's making claims that they can make you loads of money, then don't believe it, because they wouldn't be telling you that if they could make loads of money, because they'd be making loads of money themselves, and they definitely wouldn't want to share it.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I'll try to the questions in the chat, so I'll try to combine both of them on one. So the first question from Sophie is talking about what's your opinion on where do we stand in the contribution of NLP to long-term value investment? And then the other question from John is about how do you think the interpretability of advanced NLP methods could contribute to the difficulty for such work to be accepted in, let's say, the economic field, for example?
Yep. Thanks, Mahmood. Okay, so yeah, good questions. So I'll go with Sophie first. Sophie, your question's a really good one, and I mean, this is my personal view. I think NLP can make a huge contribution to long-term investment. And the reason I say that is because if you think about a lot of the information that feeds into long-term value, it's unstructured data. So it's ESG data, it's data on strategy, business model. You know, it's a whole range of things that don't fit neatly into a standard financial model. But there's loads of information out there on it now, and increasingly companies are providing information in this space. So the challenge for many investors is not that there's not really useful information out there that can inform long-term value decisions. It's more about how do they use that at scale. So you could do it for one company because you've got enough time to go away and collect all this information, but you can't scale it as an individual across a portfolio because there's just too much. And this is where NLP starts to play an important role. And this is what asset managers have started to realize. And they are now investing millions in trying to harness the information in not just to exploit short-term mispricing, but actually to take long-run investment decisions, because a lot of this unstructured data is talking about the long run. So in short, I think there's massive potential for this if done well. John, I think your question is a really important one, and I think it reflects one of the barriers that I probably should have put on my slide. I think part of the problem with advanced NLP is if you're not in that space, trying to explain those models to an audience that's familiar with those techniques is really difficult. And economics and finance and accounting, if they don't understand the models, they're probably not, they're just going to be remaining very skeptical of them. And therefore getting traction is really difficult. So I think one of the challenges for us when we're operating at this interface is how we take sophisticated methods from NLP and package them up in a way that unsophisticated users can understand. I think that's a big challenge. So kind of stripping away a lot of the technique from the NLP methods and really presenting them in a simplified way that non-experts understand, but they can still get the basic intuition. Without that, I think it's going to be really hard for people outside the discipline to fully understand what these models do and what advantages they bring. And as a consequence, they're probably going to not do much use of them should we do.
Thanks a lot, Steve. I think we're running out of time, but I think people can still get in touch with you, or if you're available during the panel later today, more questions can be discussed. Thanks a lot, sir. Another applause from our team here. Cheers, Steve.